For men, 4 screams. For bodies crushed beneath the hooves of horses they once claimed as their own. The official report would later label an accident. Witnesses whispered that it was divine justice. But the stable master who walked away from Riverside Estate that night never uttered another word about what truly happened in the paddock behind the house. And perhaps that silence was the most terrifying part of all. The sound of hooves striking flesh is something that stays with you forever. It isn't like the films. There's no swelling music, no dramatic slow motion, just the sickening, wet impact of nearly 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone colliding with a human body. And then the screaming, always the screaming. On the night of September 14th, 1864, those sounds rolled across the tobacco fields of Riverside Estate in Southern Virginia. 4 men died before dawn, trampled to death by their own horses in what the county coroner would later describe as a tragic accident of an unprecedented kind. But accidents rarely claim 4 separate victims. Accidents don't usually happen to men who spent their entire lives around horses. And accidents don't tend to leave behind a stable master who vanishes into darkness without a trace, never to be seen again. The estate itself still stands today, though the paddock where it occurred was paved over long ago. The descendants of those 4 men still live nearby, their family names carved into stone at the local cemetery. But if you ask them about that night, about what truly happened when their great-great-grandfathers died screaming in the dirt, they'll tell you they don't know. Or perhaps, more honestly, they'll tell you they don't want to know. Because some stories are better left buried. Some truths are too dark to speak aloud. And some acts of revenge are so carefully executed that even a century and a half later, they still send a chill down your spine. This is the story of Thomas Garrett, a stable master who spent 15 years caring for horses he would never own, serving men who saw him as less than human. This is a story of 4 masters who believed their wealth and position made them untouchable. And this is a story of one night in 1864 when everything changed. Revenge, after all, is patient. It watches, it waits, it learns. And when a moment finally arrives, when every piece is in place, it strikes with precision that feels almost supernatural. Yet there was nothing supernatural about what happened at Riverside Estate. What unfolded there was entirely human, and that somehow makes it far more frightening. Before we go any further into the story of Riverside Estate and the men who died there, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What state? What city? Leave a comment and let me know. And if you're ready to descend into one of the darkest tales of revenge in American history, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what comes next. Riverside Estate covered 300 acres of prime tobacco land, roughly 12 miles south of Richmond. The main house stood as a monument to antebellum wealth. White columns, wide porches wrapping around the structure, and tall windows positioned to catch the morning light just right. Behind it stretched a maze of barns, stables, and outbuildings, spreading across the land like a small village. At the center of it all stood the stable, home to some of the finest horses in Virginia. The property belonged to the Harrington family, though by 1864 ownership had become a complicated matter. The Civil War had been raging for 3 years, and the Confederate cause was beginning to collapse. Richmond itself would fall to Union forces within 7 months. But in September of 1864, the men of Riverside Estate still clung to their old way of life with desperate resolve. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the world these men lived in. Virginia in 1864 was a land of contradictions. The plantation system was dying, yet those who depended on it refused to admit it. The war had shattered the economy, ruined infrastructure, and taken the lives of thousands of young men. Still, wealthy planters convinced themselves they could preserve their lifestyles through sheer stubbornness. Riverside Estate had remained in the Harrington family for 3 generations. William Harrington had built it in 1798 using profits from tobacco and enslaved labor. His son, Edmund Harrington Sr., expanded it during the prosperous decades of the 1830s and 1840s. Now Edmund Jr. and his younger brother Charles watched it slowly decay around them, unable or unwilling to adapt to a changing world. At its height, the estate had held more than 100 enslaved people. By 1864, that number had fallen to 43. Some had been sold to raise money. Others had escaped to Union lines. A few had died from illness or exhaustion. Those who remained lived in constant uncertainty, aware that their world was ending but unsure what would come after. There were 4 men who mattered on the night everything fell apart. 4 men whose names would be recorded in local history, though not in the way they would have chosen. The first was Edmund Harrington Jr., the eldest son and nominal owner of this state. At 42, he was a man who had never worked a single day in his life, yet believed himself an authority on everything from farming to politics. He had avoided military service through a mix of wealth and convenient medical exemptions, claiming a weak heart that never seemed to interfere with his ability to drink heavily or beat the people he enslaved. Edmund was a man of contradictions. He could quote Shakespeare and speak at length about philosophy, yet saw no moral problem in owning other human beings. He liked to think of himself as a kind master, which in his mind meant reserving whippings for what he considered serious offenses instead of minor ones. He truly believed he was doing his slaves a favor by feeding and housing them, never acknowledging that he was the one who had stolen their freedom in the first place. His wife, Margaret, had died in 1859 while giving birth to their 4th child. The baby died as well. Edmund mourned for precisely 3 months before beginning an affair with a woman in Richmond, visiting her every Thursday with money he could scarcely afford to waste. His 3 surviving children were raised almost entirely by enslaved women who had no choice in the matter. Then there was his brother, Charles Harrington, 3 years younger and twice as cruel. Charles had served briefly with the Confederate cavalry until a riding accident sent him home. The injury left him with a permanent limp and a deep, simmering bitterness toward anyone he considered beneath him, which was nearly everyone. Charles never married. He lived alone in the east wing of the main house, drinking far too much and nursing long-held grievances against a world that had never given him the recognition he believed was rightfully his. Once considered handsome, years of heavy drinking and simmering resentment had left him swollen and perpetually flushed. He vented his frustrations on the enslaved people of the estate, inventing reasons to punish them for the smallest perceived mistakes. The accident that ended Charles's military service had occurred during a routine training exercise. His horse had balked at a jump, throwing him violently to the ground. The horse was a spirited young mare named Tempest, and Charles fixated on her as the source of his disgrace. He demanded she be shot, but Edmund refused, arguing that the animal was far too valuable. So Charles kept her instead, riding her relentlessly and punishing her for every imagined act of defiance. It was his way of exerting control over something, anything, in a life that increasingly felt like it was slipping beyond his grasp. The 3rd man was Marcus Whitfield, Edmund's brother-in-law and business partner. Marcus owned the neighboring property and had invested heavily in Riverside's tobacco operations. He was a calculating man, the type who kept meticulous ledgers recording every penny spent and every enslaved person purchased. To him, human beings were numbers on a page, assets to be managed and exploited for maximum return. Marcus was 50 years old, thin and precise, with wire-rimmed spectacles and fingers perpetually stained with ink. He had married Edmund's sister, Catherine, 20 years earlier in what everyone understood to be a strictly financial arrangement. Catherine had brought a sizable dowry. Marcus had brought valuable connections within Richmond's banking circles. They had no children, which suited Marcus perfectly. Children were costly and unpredictable. He visited Riverside Estate 3 times a week to examine the books and discuss business with Edmund. He took particular interest in the horses, viewing them as high-value assets that could be sold off if circumstances demanded it. It had been Marcus who suggested purchasing Thomas Garrett 15 years earlier, recognizing that a skilled stable master would significantly increase the value of their equine investments. Marcus took pride in what he considered his rationality. He did not beat enslaved people out of rage or sadism, but from cold calculation. In his mind, controlled punishment was essential to maintaining discipline and productivity. He kept records of every whipping and every penalty, carefully noting the offense and the outcome. This, he believed, made him more civilized than men like Charles, who acted purely on emotion. The fourth man was Daniel Cross, the estate's overseer. Unlike the others, Daniel had come from poverty, and that history made him the most dangerous of all. He understood powerlessness intimately and had sworn never to experience it again. His answer was absolute control over everyone beneath him, ruling the enslaved population with systematic brutality. Daniel was 38 years old, broad-shouldered and powerful from years of hard labor. He had been born into a poor farming family in North Carolina, the youngest of 7 children. At 15, he left home with nothing but the clothes he wore and a fierce determination to rise above his circumstances. He worked as a field hand, a mill laborer, a dock worker. He saved every coin, taught himself to read and write, and eventually secured a position as an assistant overseer on a plantation in South Carolina. His reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness grew, and when Edmund Harrington needed a new overseer in 1858, Daniel's name was put forward. Daniel lived alone in a small house on the edge of the estate, separated from both the main house and the slave quarters. He had no family, no friends, no existence beyond his work. His identity was entirely bound up in his position and the authority it granted him. He carried a whip at all times and never hesitated to use it. What made Daniel especially dangerous was his intelligence. He understood the psychology of domination. He knew how to dismantle a person's sense of self, how to instill fear, how to maintain order through a calculated mix of violence and unpredictability. At times he would show mercy, allowing hope to grow, only to crush it later and deepen despair. It was deliberate, methodical, and devastatingly effective. These 4 men met every Wednesday evening in the estate's study to discuss business, drink imported brandy, and congratulate themselves on their superiority. They called themselves a Riverside Council, as though they were statesmen rather than what they truly were, for men desperately trying to preserve a dying system through intimidation and violence. Their Wednesday meetings had become ritualized. They gathered at 7 o'clock after dinner. Edmund poured the brandy, expensive liquor smuggled through the Union blockade at great cost. They smoked cigars, also smuggled, and reviewed the affairs of the week. The pattern never changed. Marcus would begin with the financial report, which was always bleak. Tobacco prices were dropping. The blockade made exporting crops nearly impossible. Labor was becoming harder to control, as enslaved people grew bolder and more likely to flee. The war was draining them of resources. Edmund followed with empty reassurances, insisting everything would improve once the Confederacy achieved victory. Charles complained about the enslaved workers, about the Yankees, about his injured leg. Daniel outlined discipline problems and recommended punishments. They drank, nodded, and convinced themselves that their world was not collapsing. But it was. They all knew it, even if they refused to say it aloud. The Confederacy was failing. Slavery was unraveling. Their way of life was dying, and they were afraid. That fear made them dangerous. Desperation drives men to extreme acts. By the summer of 1864, the men of Riverside Estate were profoundly desperate. And then there was Thomas Garrett. Thomas had been at Riverside Estate for 15 years. He arrived in 1849 as a 20-year-old, purchased at auction in Richmond specifically to manage the estate's horses. His previous owner had trained him thoroughly. Thomas could soothe a panicked stallion with a quiet word, detect lameness from the slightest change in a horse's gait, and deliver a foal with the skill of a seasoned veterinarian. By every measure, he was the finest stable master in 3 counties. But Thomas was still property. He slept in a cramped room above the stable, ate whatever scraps were brought to him, and wore the same clothing until it disintegrated. He was never permitted to marry, though he loved a woman named Ruth who worked in the main house. He watched her die of fever in 1857, denied even the small mercy of sitting beside her during her final hours. Because Edmund Harrington needed a horse saddle for an afternoon ride. Thomas had been born into slavery in 1829 on a horse breeding farm in Kentucky. His mother had worked as a house servant, his father as a stable hand. He never knew his father's name. The man had been sold when Thomas was 3 years old, sent south to a plantation in Mississippi. Thomas retained only fragments of memory. Large hands lifted him into the air, a deep voice humming without words, the familiar scent of hay and worn leather. His mother died when Thomas was 12. Fever, just like Ruth years later. After that, Thomas was alone. He was raised by the other enslaved people in the quarters and learned his trade under the guidance of an elderly stable master named Benjamin, a man who recognized the boy's natural understanding of horses almost immediately. Benjamin taught him everything: how to read a horse's emotions by the angle of its ears, how to treat colic, thrush, and founder, how to train a young horse without crushing its spirit, how to deliver a foal when the birth went wrong and panic set in. Benjamin was patient and gentle, the closest thing to a father Thomas ever knew. When Benjamin died in 1848, Thomas was devastated, but along with grief, he inherited Benjamin's knowledge, his skills, and eventually his reputation. That reputation made Thomas valuable enough that when his owner fell into financial trouble, Thomas was sold at a premium price to Edmund Harrington. Thomas arrived at Riverside Estate with hope. He knew it was foolish, but he couldn't stop himself. Maybe this place would be different. Maybe these masters would be better. Maybe he could carve out something that resembled a life. That hope didn't vanish all at once. It eroded slowly, worn down by countless small cruelties, a careless insult, a needless punishment, a constant reminder that he was property, not a person. The hope died, but Thomas endured. Survival was something he understood. The horses, though, the horses were different. Thomas cared for 17 horses at Riverside Estate. He knew each one by name, temperament, and habit. He knew which ones liked long brushing strokes and which preferred short, firm ones. He knew the precise spot behind the ears that made them nicker softly in contentment. He delivered their foals, nursed them through sickness, trained them with patience instead of fear. In return, the horses trusted him completely. There was Sovereign, Edmund's magnificent bay stallion, 16 hands high, his coat shining like polished mahogany in the sun. Sovereign was proud and powerful, yet he never gave Thomas trouble. He came when called, stood quietly for grooming, and pressed his muzzle against Thomas's shoulder with something that felt unmistakably like affection. Tempest was Charles's gray mare, the same one who had thrown him during the war. She was anxious and high-strung, prone to startling at shadows. But with Thomas, she relaxed. She would rest her head against his chest and exhale softly through her nostrils, a clear sign of trust and calm. Midnight belonged to Marcus, a black gelding, steady, reliable, unremarkable at first glance, but dependable in every way. Thomas had trained Midnight from a yearling, and their bond ran deep. And then there was Brutus, Daniel's young chestnut stallion, only 3 years old, still learning, still pushing limits. Brutus was intelligent, energetic, and full of promise. Thomas trained him carefully, building respect and trust instead of fear. These 4 horses, along with the 13 others in the stable, were Thomas's entire world. They were the only beings on his estate who showed him genuine affection. They didn't see him as property. They saw him as the one who fed them, understood them, protected them, and Thomas loved them for it. But day after day, he watched the 4 men who owned these horses treat them with casual brutality. Edmund rode with spurs sharp enough to draw blood. Thomas would find Sovereign afterward, sides heaving, foam flecking his mouth, thin lines of blood seeping where the metal had bitten into flesh. Thomas would clean the wounds, rub in salve, and whisper apologies a horse could never understand. Charles whipped Tempest across the face when she hesitated at a jump. Thomas had witnessed it once, had seen the mare rear in pain and terror, watched a red welt bloom across her delicate nose. Every instinct screamed for him to intervene, to stop it, But he couldn't. Interference meant punishment, possibly death. So he stood frozen and helpless and watched. Marcus rode midnight until the gelding was lathered and shaking, then left him standing in the cold. Thomas would later find Midnight trembling in the paddock, exhausted and neglected, and spend hours warming him, preventing colic, undoing the harm caused by Marcus's indifference. Daniel beat Brutus with a riding crop for the simple offense of being young. If the stallion shied, tugged at the reins, or showed the slightest hint of independence, Daniel struck him, not to train but to dominate, to assert control. Thomas said nothing. He couldn't. Speaking meant punishment, possibly death. So he lowered his eyes, did his work, and tried not to dwell on the injustice of it all. He tried not to think about Ruth, cold beneath the earth. He tried not to think about the scars crossing his own back from whippings administered for imagined offenses. He tried not to think about the fact that he was 35 years old and would likely die in the stable, never having known freedom, never having known justice, never having lived as anything but a servant. But try not to think and succeeding are very different things. The summer of 1864 was relentless. Heat pressed down on Virginia like a physical force, turning every breath into labor. Tobacco plants sagged in the fields despite constant watering. Horses stood dull and motionless in their stalls, heads low, conserving energy just to survive. And the war news worsened with each passing week. Confederate defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg the previous year had shifted the balance. Now Union forces were tightening their grip around Richmond. General Grant's overland campaign had begun in May, and while losses were heavy on both sides, it was becoming clear that the Union could absorb casualties the Confederacy could not. At Riverside Estate, tension grew thick and dangerous. The Wednesday meetings dragged on longer and grew louder. From the stable, Thomas could hear the men to the shared wall with the study. Their voices raised, sharp with anger and fear, frustration spilling out as the world they depended on began to close in around them. Because Edmund Harrington needed a horse saddled for an afternoon ride. Thomas had been born into slavery in 1829 on a horse-breeding farm in Kentucky. His mother worked as a house servant, his father as a stable hand. Thomas never knew his father's name. The man had been sold when Thomas was only 3 years old, sent south to a plantation in Mississippi. All Thomas retained were faint impressions, large hands lifting him, a deep, steady voice, the familiar scent of hay and leather. His mother died when he was 12, taken by the same kind of fever that would later claim Ruth. After that, Thomas was alone. He was raised by the other enslaved people in the quarters and learned his trade under an elderly stable master named Benjamin, a man who quickly recognized the boy's natural connection with horses. Benjamin taught him everything he knew: how to read a horse's mood by the angle of its ears, how to treat colic, thrush, and founder, how to train a young horse without crushing its spirit, how to deliver a foal when a birth went wrong. Benjamin was patient and gentle, the closest thing Thomas ever had to a father. When Benjamin died in 1848, Thomas was devastated. But he also inherited Benjamin's knowledge, his skill, and his reputation. That reputation made him valuable enough that when his owner fell into financial trouble, Thomas could be sold for a premium price to Edmund Harrington. When Thomas arrived at Riverside Estate, he carried a quiet, foolish hope with him. Maybe this place would be different. Maybe these masters would be better. Maybe he could build something resembling a life. That hope didn't vanish all at once. It died slowly, over years, through 1,000 small cuts. Each casual cruelty, each humiliation, each reminder that he was property, not a person. The hope died, but Thomas endured. Endurance was what he did best. The horses, however, were different. Thomas cared for 17 horses at Riverside Estate. He knew each one by name, temperament, and habit. He knew how they liked to be brushed, which spot behind the ears made them nicker softly, which tone of voice calmed them when they were afraid. He delivered their foals, nursed them through illness, trained them with patience instead of fear. In return, the horses trusted him completely. There was Sovereign, Edmund's magnificent bay stallion, standing 16 hands high, his coat shining like polished mahogany in the sunlight. Proud and spirited, Sovereign never gave Thomas trouble. He came when called, stood quietly for grooming, and pressed his nose against Thomas's shoulder with something that felt very much like affection. Tempest was Charles's gray mare, the same horse that had thrown him during the war. She was nervous and high-strung, prone to startling at shadows. But with Thomas, she was calm. She rested her head against his chest and exhaled softly through her nostrils, a clear sign of trust and contentment. Midnight belonged to Marcus, a black gelding, steady, reliable, not flashy but dependable, the kind of horse you could trust without question. Thomas had trained Midnight from a yearling, and the bond between them ran deep. And then there was Brutus, Daniel's young chestnut stallion, only 3 years old, still learning, still testing limits. Intelligent and energetic, full of promise, Thomas trained him carefully, patiently, building trust and respect rather than fear. These 4 horses, along with the other 13 in the stable, were Thomas's world. They were the only beings on the estate who treated him with genuine affection. They didn't see him as property. They saw him as the one who fed them, cared for them, understood them, and Thomas loved them for it. But day after day, he watched the 4 men who owned these horses treat them with casual cruelty. Edmund rode with spurs sharp enough to draw blood. After a ride, Thomas would find Sovereign in his stall, sides heaving, foam crusted around his mouth, blood seeping from puncture wounds along his flanks. Thomas would clean the injuries, apply salve, and whisper apologies a horse could never understand. Charles struck Tempest across the face when she balked at a jump. Thomas had witnessed it once, had seen the mare rear in pain and terror, watched a welt bloom across her delicate nose. He had wanted to step in to stop it, but he couldn't. Interference meant punishment, possibly death. So he stood there helpless and watched. Marcus rode Midnight until the horse was lathered and trembling, then left him standing in the cold. Thomas would later find the gelding shivering in the paddock, exhausted and neglected, and would spend hours warming him, preventing colic, undoing the damage caused by Marcus's indifference. Daniel beat Brutus with a riding crop for the simple offense of being young and spirited. If the stallion shied, pulled at the reins, or showed any independence at all, Daniel struck him, not to train, but to dominate, to prove who was in control. Thomas said nothing. He couldn't. Speaking out meant punishment, possibly death. So he kept his head down, did his work, and tried not to think about the injustice of it all. He tried not to think about Ruth, cold in the ground. He tried not to think about the scars across his back from past whippings for imagined offenses. He tried not to think about the fact that he was 35 years old and would likely die in that stable, never knowing freedom, never knowing justice, never knowing anything but servitude. But trying not to think and succeeding are very different things. The summer of 1864 was brutal. The heat pressed down on Virginia like a physical weight, turning every breath into labor. Tobacco plants wilted in the fields despite constant watering. The horses stood listless in their stalls, heads low, too hot to do anything but endure. And the war news grew worse by the day. Confederate defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg the year before had shifted the balance. Now Union forces were tightening their grip around Richmond. General Grant's overland campaign, launched in May, was grinding forward. Losses were heavy on both sides, but it was obvious the Union could floor them in a way the Confederacy could not. The men of Riverside Estate grew increasingly agitated. Their Wednesday meetings stretched longer and grew louder. Thomas could hear them through the shared wall between the stable and the study, voices rising in anger and frustration as they discussed their worsening situation. He tried not to listen. It wasn't his business. But sound traveled easily through Oldwood, and sometimes he couldn't help but hear. "We're bleeding money," Marcus said one night in early August. "The tobacco's rotting in the warehouses because we can't ship it. The slaves cost more to feed than they produce, and the Confederate dollar is worthless." It'll turn around, Edmund insisted, though his voice lacked confidence. Once we win a few more battles, once the Yankees realize they can't break us. They've already broken us, Charles cut in. We just haven't admitted it yet. Silence followed. Then Daniel spoke, his tone cool and practical. We need to liquidate assets. Sell what we can while there's still a market. Slaves, horses, land if necessary. Get hard currency and wait out the storm. Sell the horses? Edmund sounded genuinely horrified. These are some of the finest animals in Virginia. They're worth whatever someone is willing to pay, Marcus replied flatly. And right now that isn't much, but it's better than nothing. Thomas felt his chest tighten. They were going to sell the horses. His horses, the only beings on that estate who mattered to him. Then Marcus continued, and Thomas's world tilted. The horses are our most valuable remaining assets. If we're forced to evacuate, we'll need them. But we can't take Garrett with us. Thomas froze, brush still in his hand. Sovereign's warm flank pressed against his side. Why not? Edmund asked. He's the best stable master in Virginia. Exactly, Marcus replied, which makes him valuable. We sell him in Richmond before we leave. Get whatever price we can. Use the money to reestablish ourselves elsewhere. The word struck Thomas like a blow. After 15 years, after everything, he was to be sold like furniture. What about the horses? Charles asked. Who manages them if we sell Garrett? We'll hire someone, Marcus said dismissively. A white man, someone we can trust. Trust. The word echoed in Thomas's mind. 15 years of flawless service, and they didn't trust him. 15 years of caring for their animals better than they cared for their own children, and he was still just property to be liquidated when convenient. I say we do it next week, Daniel added, before the market drops further. They talked for another hour, debating his value as if he were a horse himself. Thomas heard every word, and something inside him, something compressed and buried for 15 years, finally cracked. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his small room above the stable, listening to horses shift in their stalls below. He thought about Ruth, about the scars on his back, about every humiliation, every cruelty, every moment of powerlessness. And he thought about the horses. They trusted him. They loved him. They would do anything he asked. An idea began to take shape. It was terrible, unthinkable, and at the same time, perfectly, horrifyingly simple. But could he really do it? Could he truly kill 4 men? Not an accident, not self-defense. Premeditated murder. For 3 days, Thomas wrestled with the weight of what he was considering. He had been raised Christian, attended services in the state chapel every Sunday, taught that murder was a sin. He had also been taught that slavery was God's will, that his suffering was part of some divine plan, a belief he had abandoned long ago. What was justice in a world where the law declared you property? What was morality in a system built on the suffering of millions? If the legal system offered no protection, no path to justice, what options remained? He thought about the other enslaved people on this estate. 43 lives lived in constant fear, controlled by 4 men who saw them as less than human. If Thomas did nothing, if he allowed himself to be sold, what would become of them? Would the next overseer be Kinder, or worse than Daniel? Would Edmund's cruelty grow as desperation deepened? Would any of them survive the war? He thought about the horses. What would happen under a new stable master? Someone who didn't know them, didn't understand them, didn't care. Would they be beaten more? Worked until they collapsed? And he thought about himself. 35 years old, about to be sold, starting over under a new master, in a new place, with new cruelties. How many more years could he endure? How many more people could he watch die? How many more scars could his back carry? The moral calculation had no clean answer, but there was a choice: accept his fate and continue suffering, or seize control of his destiny, even if it meant becoming something he never wanted to be. In truth, it wasn't much of a choice at all. To understand what Thomas did next, you have to understand what those 15 years had done to him. The slow accumulation of trauma, the way cruelty compounds until it becomes something physical, something that settles into your bones. There was a day in 1851 when Edmund Harrington had him whipped for allowing Sovereign to throw a shoe, even though Thomas had warned days earlier that the horse needed new ones. 20 lashes, delivered in front of the other enslaved people as a lesson. Thomas had been 22, still new to the estate, still believing good work mattered. He spent a week recovering, sleeping on his stomach because his back was too torn to lie on. An older woman named Sarah tended his wounds. Using poultices made from herbs, she grew in secret. She told him the pain would fade, but the scars would remain. She was right about both. That was his first true lesson at Riverside Estate. Good work wasn't rewarded. It was expected, and any failure, no matter how small or unavoidable, was punished. Then there was 1853, when Charles Harrington sold Thomas's friend Jacob to a plantation in Georgia, simply because Jacob had looked at him the wrong way. Thomas was forced to help load Jacob onto the wagon, forced to watch his friend sob as he was torn away from his wife and 3 children. Jacob's wife, Mary, never recovered. She stopped speaking, stopped eating. She died 6 months later, and everyone knew it was from a broken heart. The children were sold separately the following year. Horses were generally gentle animals, despite their immense size and strength. But Thomas had seen what they were capable of. Twice in his 15 years at Riverside, he had witnessed horses kill. Once, a stallion had attacked a handler who beat him relentlessly. Another time, a mare had trampled a man who tried to separate her from her foal. In both cases, the horses had acted on instinct, defending themselves or their young. But Thomas kept asking himself a dangerous question. What if instinct could be guided? What if those protective impulses could be aimed, focused, directed at specific targets? The idea was bold. It was also lethal. If anyone suspected what he was doing, he would be killed without hesitation. So Thomas continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He fed the horses, cleaned the stalls, repaired tack, and spoke to no one about the thoughts taking root in his mind. But in the deep hours of night, when the estate slept, he worked quietly with the horses. He taught them new signals. He conditioned them to respond to specific cues. He built on the trust they already had in him and reshaped it into something else, something far more dangerous. Everything had to be subtle. Nothing could look unusual. So he folded the training into his ordinary work, disguising it as routine care. With Sovereign, he introduced a specific whistle during feeding. The sound became associated with food, safety, ownership of space. Whistle, grain. Whistle, grain. Again and again, until the sound alone triggered expectation and focus. Then Thomas added a second element. After whistling, he placed a crude dummy in the stall, a sack stuffed with hay, roughly human in size and shape. Sovereign would approach it, sniff it, circle it. Thomas rewarded him with extra grain. Then the rules changed. Thomas would whistle, place the dummy inside, and make it move slightly, tugging it with a rope from outside the stall. Sovereign would startle, ears flattening back, muscles tensing. Thomas praised him softly. Good boy. Protect your space. Protect your food. Over the course of days, the movement became more aggressive. The dummy intruded deeper into the stall. Sovereign's response escalated. He charged, struck with his hooves, bit into the sack. Every attack was rewarded. Stimulus, response, reward. The same principles used to train any animal. Only the purpose was different. With Tempest, the approach required less effort. She was already nervous, already prone to panic. Thomas only needed to create a specific trigger. He chose a gesture, a deliberate circular motion of his raised hand. Each time he made it, he followed with sudden noise. Tempest would startle and bolt. Thomas would calm her, but never completely. He always left her slightly unsettled, ensuring she associated that gesture with danger and the need to flee. Midnight required even less conditioning. The gelding was a follower by nature. Thomas reinforced that trait by exercising him alongside Sovereign. He rewarded Midnight whenever he mirrored the stallion's behavior, whenever he followed his lead. Within a week, Midnight reacted automatically, moving when Sovereign moved, charging when Sovereign charged. Brutus was different, young, energetic, still testing boundaries. Thomas chose a single word, strike, and paired it with a sharp tap to the stallion's hindquarters. Brutus kicked reflexively. Thomas rewarded him with grain and praise. Over time, the kick became stronger, more forceful. When Thomas said the word, Brutus lashed out with both hind legs, a blow powerful enough to shatter bone. To the horse, it was just a trick, a game. He had no understanding of its purpose. The remaining 13 horses required no specific conditioning. They only needed to be unsettled. Thomas began increasing their anxiety in small, careful ways. Sudden noises, unexpected movements, minor disruptions. Nothing overt, just enough to keep them on edge, ready to panic if given the right push. The work drained him. He performed his regular duties by day and his secret training by night. He watched constantly for eyes, for footsteps, for anything out of place. One mistake would end him. But Thomas had learned patience long ago. 15 years of endurance had prepared him for this. On September 10th, he overheard Marcus Whitfield tell Edmund Harrington that a buyer had been secured. A plantation owner in South Carolina was willing to pay $800. The sale would be finalized on September 20th. Thomas had 10 days. The horses were ready. The conditioning was complete. What he needed now was opportunity. A moment when all four men would be together. A place where the horses could be unleashed. And enough time to disappear before anyone understood what had happened. The Wednesday meetings were the obvious choice. Every Wednesday, the four men gathered in the study, drank heavily, and stayed late into the night. But Thomas needed them outside. He needed them in the paddock. And he needed a reason that wouldn't raise suspicion. He turned the problem over in his mind for days, searching for an answer. It arrived on September 12th. That evening, Edmund Harrington announced at dinner that he had invited a potential buyer to visit the estate on Wednesday, September 14th. A wealthy merchant from North Carolina wanted to see several horses before making an offer. "We'll bring them all out to the paddock," Edmund said, his voice echoing down the hall to where Thomas stood unnoticed in the shadows. "Let him see how they move. Garrett will have them ready by 8. Thomas felt his heart begin to pound. This was it. Him away somehow? But Edmund only nodded, satisfied, and turned to leave. "Don't embarrass me tonight," he added. "These horses are worth a great deal of money." "I understand, sir," Thomas replied. The afternoon dragged on under the relentless heat. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the land itself were holding its breath. Thomas rested when he could, conserving his strength, but sleep never came. His mind stayed sharp, alert, replaying every step of the plan again and again. There could be no mistakes. Not tonight. As evening approached, the estate began to stir. Supper was served in the main house. The four men gathered as they always did, unaware that this Wednesday would be their last. Thomas finished saddling Sovereign just as the sun dipped low, staining the sky with deep reds and purples. The light was fading quickly. Perfect. At a few minutes before 8, word came that the buyer had not yet arrived. A servant reported that a carriage had been delayed on the main road due to a collapsed bridge. Edmund cursed under his breath. Marcus frowned, calculating losses. Charles laughed bitterly and poured himself another drink. Daniel simply nodded, unsurprised. War made everything unreliable. "We'll start without him," Edmund said at last. No sense wasting the evening. "Garrett, bring the horses out." "Yes, sir." Thomas led Sovereign from the stable first, then Tempest, Midnight, and Brutus. The other horses followed, restless and uneasy, their nerves already frayed from the subtle conditioning Thomas had been building for weeks. The paddock lay behind his estate, partially shadowed now, the light uneven and deceptive. The four men stepped out onto the packed earth, glasses still in hand. They spread themselves casually along the fence, talking over one another, confident, distracted, careless. Thomas positioned the horses carefully, his heart hammered in his chest, but his face remained calm. Every movement was deliberate, every breath measured. He raised his hand slightly, just enough for Tempest to see. The circular motion was small, almost invisible to anyone else. Tempest's ears flicked back. Her muscles tightened. Thomas let out the soft whistle Sovereign knew so well. The stallion lifted his head instantly, ears pricked forward. Food, territory, threat. Thomas tossed a sack into the paddock, a heavy canvas bundle stuffed with hay, letting it land near Edmund and Marcus. At first, it lay still. "What's that for?" Charles scoffed. Before Thomas could answer, he gave the signal again, a second whistle, a sharp word barely audible. The sack moved. Sovereign charged. The stallion's sudden motion startled the other horses. Tempest panicked exactly as Thomas knew she would, bolting blindly. Midnight followed without hesitation, driven by instinct. Brutus reared, confused and overstimulated. The men shouted. Glass shattered. Someone laughed nervously, thinking it was a show gone wrong. Then Sovereign struck. The stallion slammed into Edmund, hooves crashing down with brutal force. The sound was sickening, wet, heavy, final. Edmund screamed once before the sound was cut short. Tempest collided with Charles as he tried to move out of her path. She trampled him in blind terror, hooves striking again and again, driven by panic Thomas had carefully planted. Marcus turned to run. Thomas shouted a single word. Strike. Brutus lashed out with both hind legs, connecting squarely with Marcus's chest. The impact lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into fence, where Midnight followed, hooves pounding until there was no movement left. Daniel reached for his whip, his instincts screaming danger. He tried to assert control, shouting commands, stepping toward Brutus. Thomas whistled again. The remaining horses surged forward, chaos exploding across the paddock. Daniel went down beneath them, crushed under muscle and bone, the very violence he'd wielded against others finally turning on him. The screams echoed across the fields, then faded, one by one, swallowed by the night. It was over in less than a minute. Thomas stood perfectly still as the horses circled, snorting and stamping, their energy slowly bleeding away. He moved among them calmly, speaking softly, touching their necks, their flanks. Gradually, they settled. Trust reasserted itself. For bodies lay broken in the dirt. Lanterns appeared in the distance as servants ran toward the paddock, shouting in confusion and terror. Thomas didn't wait for them. He led the horses back to the stable, secured them, soothed them, returned everything to order with practiced efficiency. Then he took nothing with him and walked away into the darkness. By morning, the official story would already be forming. A tragic accident. Horses spooked. Men in the wrong place at the wrong time. The coroner would sign the report. The estate would whisper. The stable master would be gone. And no one would ever hear Thomas Garrett speak again. Toward them, directly toward the fence where they stood. Thomas had calculated the distance perfectly. The men had just enough time to react, just enough time to realize something was wrong, and not enough time to escape. Tempest slammed into the fence with explosive force. The old wooden rails cracked and splintered, weakened by years of neglect. Charles shouted as the fence gave way beneath him. He stumbled backward into the paddock, his bad leg failing him, his balance gone. Tempest screamed again and veered sharply, hooves churning the dirt as she ran straight through the space where the men had been standing seconds earlier. Chaos erupted instantly. Garrett, control her. Edmund shouted, his voice high with sudden fear. But Thomas didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his face calm, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear out of his chest. The other horses felt it immediately. The noise, the movement, the panic. Thomas raised the whistle to his lips and blew the sharp, specific sound Sovereign had learned to associate with threat, intrusion, danger in his space. The great bay stallion lifted his head, his ears flattened, his muscles tensed. At the same moment, Thomas made the second gesture, subtle but unmistakable, the one Midnight had been conditioned to follow. The black gelding turned towards Sovereign without hesitation. What in God's name? Marcus began, backing away from the broken fence. Sovereign charged. The stallion exploded forward, 16 hands of raw power surging across the paddock. Marcus turned to run, but Midnight followed Sovereign instinctively, hooves pounding the ground in unison. Marcus tripped, catch his foot on the broken rail, and went down hard. The sound that followed was unmistakable. A wet, heavy impact, bone meeting muscle, flesh crushed beneath iron-shod hooves. Marcus screamed once. It was short. It ended abruptly. Daniel Cross reacted faster than the others. Years of violence had sharpened his instincts. He lunged toward the gate, reaching for it with desperate strength. Thomas looked at Brutus. "Strike," he said quietly. The young chestnut stallion reared, startled by the word and the sudden movement. Daniel turned just in time to see the horse come down. Both hind legs slammed into Daniel's chest with devastating force. The impact lifted him off his feet and threw him backward into the dirt. Brutus came down again, hooves flailing, driven by fear and confusion. Daniel tried to crawl. He didn't make it far. Edmund Harrington stood frozen near the fence, paralyzed by disbelief, his mouth open and closed, no words coming out. He had never been powerless before. He had never faced consequences he couldn't buy or whip away. Tempest circled back, still panicking, still running. Thomas blew the whistle again, sharp and commanding. Sovereign turned. Edmund finally moved, trying to climb the fence, his expensive boots slipping on the smooth wood. Sovereign reached him first. The stallion struck with his forelegs, slamming Edmund against the fence. Edmund screamed as he fell into the paddock, his cry drowned out by the thunder of hooves. Charles was already on the ground, scrambling, dragging his useless leg behind him. He looked up just as Tempest barreled toward him. There was recognition in his eyes. Fear, understanding. She didn't slow down. The impact knocked the breath from his body. Hooves came down again and again. The sound was exactly what Thomas remembered. Wet, heavy, final. It was over in less than a minute. When the horses finally scattered, when the dust began to settle, for bodies lay broken in the paddock behind Riverside Estate, for men who had believed themselves untouchable, for men crushed beneath the animals they had used, abused, and controlled for years. Thomas stood where he was, breathing hard, his hands trembling. The horses slowed, confused, frightened, looking to him for guidance. He raised his arms slowly, speaking softly, using the calming tones they trusted. "It's all right," he whispered. "It's over. You're safe now." Sovereign approached him, sides heaving. Tempest shook, foam flecking her mouth. Midnight stood close, seeking reassurance. Brutus lowered his head, uncertain. Thomas moved among them, steadying them, soothing them, doing what he had always done, caring, protecting. From the house, someone was screaming. From the quarters, doors were opening. Thomas knew he had no time left. He led the horses back toward the stable, unlatched the gate, and opened a path that led away from the estate, toward the tree line and the river beyond. One by one, the horses followed him, trusting him as they always had. By the time anyone reached the paddock, Thomas Garrett was already disappearing into the night, leaving behind 4 bodies, a shattered estate, and a silence that would haunt Riverside forever. The coroner would later call an accident. Witnesses would whisper about divine judgment, and the stable master who vanished that night would never be seen again. But some people, even generations later, swear they can still hear it if they stand on that ground at dusk. The sound of hooves on flesh, and the screaming, room above the stable, and gathered the few things he owned. A spare shirt, a worn pair of boots, the small bundle of dried herbs Sarah had once given him years ago, still tucked away like a talisman. He moved quickly but calmly, every motion deliberate. Panic would only slow him down. Below him, voices rose in confusion and terror. Some people were praying. Others were crying. A few were arguing loudly about what had happened, already trying to make sense of the impossible scene in the paddock. Thomas ignored it all. He climbed down the ladder, walked through the stable one last time, and paused. The horses watched him. Sovereign stood quietly, his stall head lowered, breathing slow. Tempest trembled but calm when Thomas rested a hand against her neck. Midnight nickered softly. Brutus shifted his weight, ears flicking forward, alert but no longer aggressive. They were done now. Whatever line Thomas had crossed, he would cross it alone. Easy, he whispered, moving from stall to stall. It's over. He opened the rear door of the stable and stepped into the darkness. The path beyond the barns led toward the woods, then north, toward routes he knew well. He had no map, no money, no guarantee of survival. But for the first time in his life, the next step was his to choose. By morning, Thomas Garrett was gone. The county investigation would come later. The coroner would examine the bodies and shake his head. For men, for deaths, crushed beneath panic horses. A tragic accident, he would write. Witnesses would speak of chaos, of animals spooked beyond control, of men in the wrong place at the wrong time. No one would mention signals or whistles or years of quiet preparation. The official story would harden quickly, because the truth was too unsettling to face. They searched for Thomas for weeks. Some said he'd fled north. Others claimed he'd been killed by Union patrols. A few whispered darker things, that he'd been helped by people who understood exactly why he'd done what he'd done. But no one ever found him. The stable master vanished as completely as the men he left behind. Riverside Estate survived the war, barely, without its owners. It fell into disrepair. The horses were sold off. The paddock where the killings occurred was eventually filled in and paved over, as if erasing the ground itself might erase the memory. But stories lingered. They always do. Even generations later, locals would say the air felt wrong behind the old estate, that horses brought there grew restless, that no matter how carefully the land was cleared, nothing ever quite grew right in that spot. And some nights, when the wind blew just right, people swore they could still hear it. The distant thunder of hooves and the echoes of screams carried across fields that once bore tobacco and blood. For men, for screams, for bodies crushed beneath the weight of a system that had believed itself eternal. And one man who refused to disappear quietly, because Edmund Harrington needed a horse saddled for an afternoon ride. Thomas Garrett had been born into slavery in 1829 on a horse breeding farm in Kentucky. His mother worked in the main house, his father in the stables. He never knew his father's name. The man had been sold when Thomas was 3 years old, shipped south to a plantation in Mississippi. Thomas retained only fragments of memory. Large hands lifting him, a deep voice, the smell of hay and leather. His mother died when he was 12. Fever, just like Ruth. After that, Thomas was raised by the other enslaved people in the quarters. He learned his trade from an elderly stable master named Benjamin, a man who recognized a boy's rare instinct with horses. Benjamin taught him everything: how to read a horse's mood by the angle of its ears, how to treat colic, thrush, and founder, how to train a young horse without breaking spirit, how to deliver a foal when something went wrong. Benjamin was patient and gentle, the closest thing Thomas ever had to a father. When Benjamin died in 1848, Thomas was heartbroken, but he inherited Benjamin's knowledge, his skill, and eventually his reputation. That reputation made him valuable enough that when his owner ran into financial trouble, Thomas was sold at a premium price to Edmund Harrington. Thomas arrived at Riverside Estate with hope. He knew it was foolish, but he couldn't help it. Maybe this place would be different. Maybe these masters would be kinder. Maybe he could build something that resembled a life. That hope didn't die all at once. It faded slowly, death by 1,000 cuts. Every casual cruelty, every humiliation, every reminder that he was property, not a person. The hope died, but Thomas endured. Endurance was what he was best at. The horses, though, the horses were different. Thomas cared for 17 horses at Riverside Estate. He knew each one by name, by temperament, by the way they liked to be brushed, by the exact spot behind the ears that made them nicker softly. He delivered their foals, nursed them through illness, trained them with patience instead of fear. In return, the horses trusted him completely. There was Sovereign, Edmund's magnificent bay stallion, 16 hands high with a coat that shone like polished mahogany, proud and spirited, yet never difficult with Thomas. He came when called, stood quietly for grooming, and pressed his nose to Thomas's shoulder with genuine affection. Tempest was Charles's gray mare, the horse that had thrown him during the war. She was nervous, high-strung, prone to panic. But with Thomas, she was calm. She rested her head against his chest and breathed softly through her nostrils, a sign of trust. Midnight was Marcus's black gelding, steady, reliable, not flashy but dependable. Thomas had trained him from a yearling, and the bond between them was strong. And then there was Brutus, Daniel's young chestnut stallion. Only 3 years old, intelligent, energetic, still learning. Thomas trained him carefully, building respect instead of fear. These 4 horses and the 13 others were Thomas's world. They were the only beings on the estate who treated him with something like affection. They didn't see him as property. They saw him as the one who fed them, understood them, cared for them, and Thomas loved them for it. But every day, he watched their owners abuse them. Edmund drove Sovereign hard, using spurs until blood ran. Thomas would find the stallion afterward, sides heaving, foam in his mouth, blood seeping from puncture wounds. Thomas cleaned the injuries, applied salve, and whispered apologies. Charles whipped Tempest across the face when she balked at a jump. Thomas saw it once, the mare rearing in pain, a welt rising across her nose. He wanted to intervene. He didn't. Interfering meant punishment, possibly death. Marcus rode midnight until the gelding was lathered and shaking, then left him standing in the cold. Thomas would find him later, shivering in the paddock, and spend hours undoing the damage. Daniel beat Brutus with a riding crop for the simple crime of being young. Any sign of independence was met with violence, not to train but to dominate. Thomas said nothing. He couldn't. Speaking meant death. He kept his head down and tried not to think about Ruth, cold in the ground. Tried not to think about the scars on his back from past whippings. Tried not to think about the fact that he was 35 years old and would likely die in that stable, never knowing freedom. But try not to think and succeeding are very different things. The summer of 1864 was brutal. Heat pressed down on Virginia like a physical force. The tobacco wilted. The horses stood listless in their stalls. And the war news grew worse by the day. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Grant tightening his grip around Richmond. The Wednesday meetings grew louder, longer, angrier. Thomas overheard more than he wanted to. "We're bleeding money," Marcus said one night in early August. "The tobacco's rotting. The slaves cost more to feed than they produce." "It'll turn around," Edmund insisted without conviction. "The Yankees already broke us," Charles snapped. "We just won't admit it." Then Daniel's voice, cold and precise. "We liquidate assets. Slaves, horses, land. Sell the horses?" Edmund protested. "They're worth whatever someone will pay," Marcus replied. Thomas's heart sank. Then Marcus said the words that changed everything. "We can't take Garrett with us. We sell him in Richmond." Thomas froze, Sovereign's warm flank against his side. They debated his value like livestock. That night, something inside him finally broke. He didn't sleep. He thought about Ruth, about every humiliation, about the horses, and an idea formed, terrible, unthinkable, and perfectly simple. Could he kill 4 men? The next days were agony. Faith, morality, justice, all meaningless in a world where the law said he was property. If the system offered no justice, what choice remained? He thought about the other enslaved people, about the horses, about himself. In the end, there was no real choice. What came next was a result of 15 years of accumulated cruelty. He remembered the whipping in 1851, the sale of his friend Jacob. Ruth's death in 1857 denied even the right to sit beside her because Edmund wanted a ride. After Ruth died, Hope died too. He survived, but he stopped living. Then he overheard the plan to sell him, and the numbness shattered. Thomas planned carefully, quietly, patiently. He trained the horses in subtle ways, teaching them signals, reinforcing instincts, shaping fear and aggression into something controllable. By September 10th, he learned the sale date, September 20th. He had 10 days. The opportunity came when Edmund invited a buyer to view the horses on September 14th. Thomas sabotaged the bridge. On the night of September 13th, he weakened it just enough. The buyer would be delayed. The rest unfolded exactly as Thomas planned. The horses, the paddock, the signals, the panic, the hooves. 4 men died beneath animals they had abused. Thomas stood untouched in the chaos. When it was over, he disappeared. The official report called it an accident. The truth was buried. The horses were sold. The estate fell. The family scattered. And Thomas Garrett was never seen again. There were rumors, Philadelphia, Canada, Maryland, but no certainty. He vanished into history. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. Because Edmund Harrington needed a horse saddled for an afternoon ride. Thomas had been born into slavery in 1829 on a horse breeding farm in Kentucky. His mother worked as a house servant. His father was a stable hand whose name Thomas never knew. That man had been sold when Thomas was 3 years old, sent south to a plantation in Mississippi. All Thomas retained were fragments, large hands, a deep voice, the mixed scent of hay and leather. His mother died when he was 12, taken by fever, the same illness that would later claim Ruth. After that, Thomas grew up essentially alone, raised by others in the quarters. He learned his trade from an elderly stable master named Benjamin, a man who noticed the boy's instinctive understanding of horses. Benjamin taught him everything: how to read a horse's move from the angle of its ears, how to treat colic, thrush, and founder, how to train a young animal without breaking its spirit, how to deliver a foal when a birth went wrong. Benjamin was patient, gentle, and steady, the closest thing to a father Thomas ever had. When Benjamin died in 1848, Thomas was devastated. But he also inherited Benjamin's knowledge, his skill, and his reputation. That reputation made him valuable. Valuable enough that when his owner fell on hard times, Thomas was sold for a high price to Edmund Harrington. He arrived at Riverside Estate carrying a foolish hope. Maybe this place would be different. Maybe these masters would be kinder. Maybe he could build something resembling a life. That hope died slowly. Death by 1,000 small cuts. Every casual cruelty, every humiliation, every reminder that he was property and not a person chipped away at it. The hope died, but Thomas endured. That was what he did. He survived. The horses, though, were different. Thomas cared for 17 horses at Riverside Estate. He knew each one by name, temperament, and habit. The way one preferred to be brushed, the exact spot behind another's ears that made them nicker with pleasure. He delivered their foals, nursed them through sickness, trained them patiently and gently. In return, the horses trusted him completely. There was Sovereign, Edmund's magnificent bay stallion, 16 hands tall, his coat gleaming like polished mahogany in the sunlight. Proud and spirited, Sovereign never gave Thomas trouble. He came when called, stood calmly for grooming, and pressed his muzzle against Thomas's shoulder with unmistakable affection. Tempest belonged to Charles, the gray mare who had thrown him during the war. Nervous and high-strung, she spooked easily, but with Thomas she was calm. She rested her head against his chest and breathed softly through her nostrils, a sign of trust. Midnight was Marcus's black gelding, steady and dependable, not flashy, but reliable. Thomas had trained him from a yearling, and the bond between them was deep. And Brutus belonged to Daniel, a young chestnut stallion, barely 3 years old, still learning, still testing boundaries. Intelligent and energetic, full of promise. Thomas trained him carefully, building respect and trust instead of fear. These 4 horses, along with the other 13, were Thomas's entire world. They were the only beings on the estate who showed him genuine affection. They didn't see him as property. They saw him as the one who fed them, protected them, and understood them. But Thomas also watched, day after day, as the 4 men who owned these horses treated them with casual brutality. Edmund rode with spurs sharp enough to draw blood. Thomas would find Sovereign afterward, sides heaving, foam in his mouth, blood seeping where the spurs had bitten. Thomas cleaned the wounds, applied salve, and whispered apologies a horse could never understand. Charles struck Tempest across the face when she balked at a jump. Thomas had seen it once, watched the mare rear in pain and terror, seen the welt bloom across her delicate nose. He'd wanted to intervene. He couldn't. Interference meant punishment, possibly death. Marcus rode midnight until the gelding was lathered and trembling, then left him standing in the cold. Thomas would find him shivering in the paddock, exhausted and neglected, and spend hours warming him, preventing colic, undoing the damage of indifference. Daniel beat Brutus with a riding crop for the simple crime of being young. Any sign of independence, a shy, a pull at the reins, and the whip came down, not to train, but to dominate. Thomas said nothing. Speaking meant punishment, possibly death. So he kept his head down, did his work, and tried not to think about the injustice. He tried not to think about Ruth in the cold ground. He tried not to think about the scars on his back from past whippings. He tried not to think about being 35 years old and likely dying in that stable, never knowing freedom. Trying not to think and succeeding are not the same thing. The summer of 1864 was merciless. Heat pressed down on Virginia like a physical force. Tobacco wilted in the fields. Horses stood dull-eyed in their stalls. And the war news grew worse. Gettysburg and Vicksburg had already shifted the tide. Now Union forces were tightening around Richmond. The Wednesday meetings grew louder, longer. Thomas heard them through the stable wall, voices raised in anger and fear. "We're bleeding money," Marcus said one night in August. "The tobacco's rotting. Feeding the slaves costs more than they produce. Confederate currency is worthless." "It'll turn around," Edmund insisted without conviction. "The Yankees already broke us," Charles snapped. "We just won't admit it." Daniel's voice followed, cold and efficient. "We liquidate assets. Slaves, horses, land if needed. Sell the horses?" Edmund protested. "They're worth whatever someone will pay," Marcus replied. Thomas's heart sank. But then Marcus said the words that changed everything. "We can't take Garrett with us. We sell him in Richmond." Thomas froze, brush still in his hand, Sovereign's warm flank against him. They debated his value like livestock. 15 years of service reduced to numbers. That night, something inside Thomas finally broke. He didn't sleep. He sat above the stable listening to the horses and thought about Ruth, about every cruelty, every indignity. And he thought about the horses. They trusted him. They would do anything he asked. The idea came, terrible, unthinkable, and perfectly simple. Could he kill 4 men? For 3 days he wrestled with it. Murder was a sin, he'd been taught. But so was his suffering supposed to be God's will, and he no longer believed that. What was justice when the law said you were property? By the end, there was no real choice. Thomas remembered every lesson Riverside had taught him. the whipping in 1851 for a lost shoe, Jacob sold away in 1853, Ruth dying alone in 1857. After Ruth, hope died. Survival remained. So he planned. He trained the horses subtly, patiently. Signals, whistles, gestures, conditioning layered into routine. Sovereign learned that a certain whistle meant intrusion and threat. Tempest learned that a specific gesture meant danger, run. Midnight learned to follow Sovereign without question. Brutus learned one word, strike. The other horses were kept on edge, primed for panic. On September 10th, Thomas learned he would be sold on the 20th. He had 10 days. The opportunity came when a buyer was expected on September 14th. Thomas sabotaged the bridge that night, ensuring the man would be delayed but not killed. Wednesday dawned hot and clear. Thomas knew it was his last day at Riverside. He prepared the horses meticulously, whispering apologies, promises. The buyer didn't arrive. The bridge had collapsed. The four men decided to watch the horses anyway. Thomas led them into the paddock. He stood among the horses, calm in the center of the storm to come. And then he gave the signal. Tempest panicked, smashed the fence, crushed Charles. Sovereign charged, killing Edmund. Midnight followed, destroying Marcus. Brutus struck Daniel down. The paddock became chaos, hooves, dust, screams, and then silence, for bodies lay broken in the dirt. Thomas called the all clear. The horses calmed. He checked the men. All were dead. He felt nothing. Within minutes, the estate erupted in confusion. Thomas gathered his few belongings, said goodbye to the horses, and walked into the night. The official report called it an accident. Thomas Garrett disappeared. The horses were sold. The estate fell. The family lost everything. Some whispered of justice, others of coincidence. The enslaved people knew better and said nothing. Thomas was never seen again. Maybe he reached freedom. Maybe he didn't. What remains is the question. Justice or murder? Thomas had no legal recourse, no protection, only his knowledge, his patience, and the trust of animals who never betrayed him. So he acted, and when it was over, he walked away. Some stories refuse easy answers, and maybe that's the point. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next.